All right, so I'll reintroduce myself because that's my first slide. Brian Cardarella. I am the founder and outgoing CEO of Dockyard. I'm actually leaving the company at the end of this year. This has been something that's been in the works. I put in my notice in 2016. It's taken, I know, it's an extremely long notice. The part of that, though, is for those of you that run consultancies, especially if you founded a consultancy, a big part of the consulting company is kind of bought in on your personality to a degree. You're ingrained in every aspect of it, and it takes a while to kind of remove yourself from the company. So I wanted to leave the company in the best standing possible and give it enough time to absorb me being able to delegate off everything that I was doing. However, I can say that the company is dedicated to supporting all of the Elixir investment efforts that we've made and make more in the future. The new CEO is John Lax. He has been COO of Dockyard for the past few years, and he and I see eye to eye on all these things. So if people are concerned that some of the stuff that we've been doing, like supporting Chris on Phoenix or Paul on releases or some of the work that we're doing on Lumen, that's not going away. I'm still owner of the company. I'm just moving on to something else. So hopefully people have heard about Dockyard at this point, but for those that haven't or would like to learn more about Dockyard. So we are a full-stack software consultancy. We do back-end, front-end, client-side application development, database design. We do actual user interface design. We do project management. So if you come to us with a project, an idea, we can implement it. If you come to us saying, hey, our current application, we want to build a new one, we can rebuild it. We can do user research for you. We can do everything to give you a successful product. In addition to that, we have expert Elixir consulting. So if your company is adopting Elixir and they're looking to get the most out of it, ramp up your team, really optimize and make your applications as performant as possible, or if you just want to say that we had Chris McCord on the project and show the Git commits, you can come to us for that. By the way, Chris says I don't sell him enough, so I actually feel weird doing that sometimes, but he keeps telling me, like, use me, so I'm using him. We have worked with some of the largest brands over the past few years and some of the most innovative startups. So some of our Elixir clients include Apple, Netflix. There was a presentation at ElixirConf on our work with Cars.com on rebuilding that platform. We worked with POA and Pleroma. So I know that the theme of the conference is on adoption. Is on emerging Elixir. I think that a big part of that has to always be adoption, though, and it's actually a subject that I'm very, it's kind of near and dear to my heart. I gave a somewhat similar talk, a more focused talk on business reasons for Elixir at Lone Star Elixir Conference, and this is kind of a higher level thing. The one at Lone Star was meant to be collateral that engineers can bring into their company if they want to make a business case for why Elixir is a technology to adopt. This presentation is going to be more focused on kind of looking at assessing Elixir's place in the world right now and ways that we can improve it. So I want to start out with a story, which is at Lone Star Elixir Conference. Before I go into this is the logo from 2019 conference. If you go on the Lone Star Elixir Conf website, Jim made the logo really, really small. And I think the reason for that is because he didn't want to bother updating the date on it. So this is and his son Chris works for us, and I posted in our company Slack. He admitted that this was a known thing. In any event, at some point during the conference, I just ducked into the speaker lounge, but I happened to crash a podcast that was going on. I didn't realize that a podcast was being recorded, but it was a panel podcast, and it was the that was Boston for a minute right there. Smart Software Podcast. It was a Smart Software Podcast with Smart Logic. Eric and Justice were recording it, and like Jose, Chris, Paul, a bunch of others were in the room, It's a pretty good podcast, that particular episode, in terms of getting a bunch of the leaders in Elixir in one room. I recommend going back and listening to it. But when I came in the room, Justice was nice enough to try to include me into the conversation. And the question he posed to me was something along the lines of, I'm paraphrasing, but something along the lines of, how can Elixir win? And dethrone Java. So my response to this, I had about 5 seconds to think about it. My response to this on the podcast was, I don't think that can happen. I don't think that's a realistic expectation. If we are, as a community, that our goal is to, become #1 language on the planet, we're going to be in for a bumpy ride and probably very upset with the outcome. And there's a couple reasons for this that I'll get into later in the presentation. But I kind of gave a counterpoint that I thought that maybe it was more realistic for Elixir to shoot for like top 3 or 5. And I just said that off the top of my head without really kind of having any context on what those numbers look like either. Afterwards, when the podcast came out and I listened to it, I remembered that I said that. I was like, I wonder what the other top 3 or 5 languages are. So people are probably familiar with the TIOB software language ranking, and I understand that we have to always take rankings with a grain of salt, right? These aren't definitive. TOBs are essentially an aggregate of content that's out there in the form of blog posts, videos, social media. So they try to at least pull in different sources of data. It's not like GitHub stars or something ridiculous like that. But I think we can probably agree that this list seems like it's pretty reasonable. But the top 5 languages are Java, C, Python, C++, and C#. And like top 5 is not going to be something that Elixir breaks into anytime soon. So I was way off on that. So I was kind of curious to see where Elixir ranked on this list. The next 30 languages is not there. I was like, what's going on? Like, I'm super excited about Elixir. Why aren't other people super excited about Elixir? How is it that VBScript is more popular than Elixir? This doesn't make sense to me. And again, you gotta understand that rankings are what they are sometimes. But there's a paragraph after this of the next 50 programming languages that, in no particular order, they just put them in alphabetical order. So I highlighted Elixir there, and Erlang is right next to it. However, if you were to look back at the top 50, the last one there, according to TOB's rankings, I think it was like PostScript or something, had about 0.175% of mindshare in the space. So that means that, according to this ranking system, Elixir is somewhere south of 0.175%. Okay, so let's look at another somewhat trusted source. This is from ThoughtWorks, their tech radar that they publish, I think, every few months. Maybe it's quarterly. I'm not really sure the frequency of the publishing of it, but so when I started consultancy, I have a lot of respect for ThoughtWorks. I really like how they built their business over time. They did recently get acquired, I think maybe last year. So I'm not really sure at how, if these tech radars are continuing to be put out, and what culturally has changed, if anything, within ThoughtWorks. But historically, I've really liked the company. And I tend to trust, but give them a certain amount of trust and weight behind what they say if they're looking at something in their tech radar. Anyway, Elixir hasn't shown up on their tech radar since March of 2017, and it was listed in trial phase. So I forget what the first, it's like introduction phase or something like that, and then it moves on to trial, and then there's an adoption phase. And according to ThoughtWorks' tech radar, Elixir has never made it to that adoption phase. They don't give any update why. They don't talk about what happened with Elixir internally with them, why it kind of moved off or hasn't been reassessed. But Phoenix is also on there as a technology, and its dates and phase towards adoption match what ELIXIR'S is. So I'm kind of led to believe that perhaps they had a ELIXIR, more likely a Phoenix project going on at the time, and they may not have had one since, for whatever reason. So if it's on there, kind of like out of sight, out of mind, everything. But again, they don't talk about it. They don't give us any reason why they haven't readdressed it, so I'm only left to speculate. So in any event, this feels like it's not good, right? We're super excited about this language. We want people to use it. We feel happy. I feel happy writing ELIXIR code. I hope everyone else feels happy writing ELIXIR code. So why is the rest of the world not paying attention? But is it not good? I mean, let's go back and look at, let's move forward to another survey. So Stack Overflow puts out their annual developer survey, and ELIXIR comes in at 1.4%. So that's much better than somewhere south of 0.175%. So if I do my quick math, that's an 8x improvement, which is fantastic. That math is completely legitimate. What's a lot more encouraging, though, is that they have not just the list of languages that they are using, but they have a list of languages that people love. And ELIXIR scores very, very high on this. So they score nearly 70%, which I think is awesome, considering how low the usage rate appears to be. And so of course I have to show the other side of it is that 31.8% dread ELIXIR. But we don't have any context on why they love it, why they dread it. So we're kind of, again, left to speculate a little bit. And I've never taken the survey on Stack Overflow, so I don't know what form the data entry comes in. I did go back and look at previous year surveys, and this 2019 was the first one that ELIXIR showed up for. So it's not clear to me if the previous years where it was a free-form type and I type in what I want, or if you're given a predetermined list of options, and ELIXIR just didn't make the cut the previous years. In any event, ELIXIR's on the board now, so it'll be interesting to see how it grows over time. So ultimately, do we care about these numbers? I mean, do they make any sense to us? Does it influence when you all leave here today? Are you going to say, oh, ELIXIR isn't high on the TOB ranking, I'm not going to write any more ELIXIR? Probably not. It could be argued that TOB scoring favors programming languages of tenure, right? So if their algorithm is to go out and aggregate all the data that's out there through search engines, through YouTube, through social media, if a language has been around for a longer period of time, it stands to reason it's going to have more content out there to have it raise up on the ranking. It could be argued that ThoughtWorks simply just never had another ELIXIR or Phoenix project. And Stack Overflow's data could be heavily influenced by languages that people have problems with. Like, you don't go to Stack Overflow if you're not having problems writing ELIXIR. You go there if you're having problems writing JavaScript, apparently. So it's like these are not scientific surveys. They're anecdotal data points. They could be interesting over drinks at a bar or something. They shouldn't decide for us on, or even for companies, on I'm going to go look at the top TOB ranking. I'm going to look at what Stack Overflow says I should use. One other thing to note is that if you look at all these languages and that are ranked very highly, the pattern starts to emerge that many of them are imperative and object-oriented languages, C-style specifically. Recently, Richard Feldman at, I'm going to mispronounce this big time, Clojure, it's a Clojure conference, I don't know. In 2019, he's a core member on the Elm team, and he gave an amazing talk, it was back in September, on why isn't functional programming the norm? And this is the moment where I pause for a second for those that are watching the video on YouTube to go I guess you have to type that in, or it's a lot easier to just search for Richard's presentation. Go watch that. He gives an excellent talk on his thoughts, some history behind the rise of functional programming, some of the kind of complexities facing it to breaking out, and why is it that imperative programming and object-oriented programming is so prevalent today. So I'll reference his talk a little bit later on. Again, it's a really, really good talk. But what I will say is that one path towards Elixir adoption is to rise all the boats in the functional programming world, right? I hear quite a bit from developers that just the term functional programming scares them off. Their minds kind of tune out at that point. And I know that it's a very simple concept, but there's something that's there. There's a stink attached to it for whatever reason, culturally in programming, that is something that the community has to put in some time and some effort, not just Elixir, across all functional programming languages. If people are invested in their language and they want to make sure it's successful, I think all the functional programming language could collaborate and come up with some sort of messaging on why functional programming should be considered and the values of it. So people think about like how companies evaluate potential technology, and after running a consultancy for 10 years and trying to sell software solutions into companies, I have come up with my own kind of 3 things, and each of them feed into each other to a particular degree on the test, essentially, that technology has to pass in order to be adopted into a company. The first thing we have to realize is that it's not companies evaluating potential technology. It's people at companies evaluating potential technology. We kind of think of companies as this like amorphous blob thing, but we have to realize that we're talking to people, and our messaging has to be around people, and realize what their value propositions and their desires are, and make sure that the messaging aligns with that. So the very first one is complete. These are actually going to be very obvious. But does the technology do what I want? That's the first step. So if you're coming to a particular technology and it doesn't meet your needs, okay, gone. We're going to go out to the next one. And this isn't just a sense of performance. This is feature set. This is library. This is how quickly it's going to be to build the application. So Elixir has some really good solutions that are already in place. We have Phoenix on the back end. We have Nerves with IoT. We have Scenic, which is a fantastic UI library. If you haven't tried it yet, I highly suggest it. And the capabilities that we tend to talk about that Elixir has, and we try to use these as values back to companies, are the high concurrency, high reliability, and then the ease of use. But we should be talking about the gap areas. Right? We should be finding out where is Elixir currently deficient against the other languages that are out there and trying to fill in these gaps. Some of the gaps that we've seen that clients come to us asking about are WebAssembly compilation, native compilation, machine learning, natural language processing, side tools. So I'm going to talk about the first 2 because this is something that we're directly trying to solve at Dockyard. And that is with Lumen. If you saw the ELIXIR'S opening keynote with myself, Paul, and Luke, I won't go too much into Lumen again, but I'll just quickly summarize that a few years ago, I really wanted to kind of stop writing JavaScript day to day, and so I started poking around to see if there was any desire or some sort of effort to, at that time, really just do a syntax compiler or transpiler for Elixir into WebAssembly. And it didn't really get any steam behind it. And that I think was primarily due to WebAssembly was still nebulous. It hadn't hit 1.0 yet, so it was just under, the spec was under constant churn. But as it got closer to 1.0, some of the things that were getting into WebAssembly started to kind of resonate, like, oh yeah, this could actually be something beyond just a syntax compiler. This is something that we could potentially even do where we're compiling the beam into the browser. So at 2 ELIXIR'S ago, I announced it, saying, hey, we want to hire someone to do this, we want to invest in this. As it turns out, we already had 2 extremely capable and great engineers internally that approached me about doing it, Paul and Luke. And a few months later, we ended up hiring Hans because he was working on an interpreter already. And that team has been dedicated on building out Lumen for almost well over half a year at this point. So definitely, it didn't start like full-time until around February. And what we demonstrated at the conference was kind of like proof of concept. We ran some Elixir code in the browser. We were instantiating processes. We were showing off supervisor trees and killing off processes, letting them kind of the supervisor restart them gracefully. I mean, as always, when you see how the sausage is made, it's a little bit different. And we were kind of scrambling to get to something that was demoable at the conference. And unfortunately, that meant that we had to kind of cut corners in order to get there. What was shown was still legitimate code, but it wasn't as clean, it wasn't as extendable as we wanted. So I've given the team the opportunity to go back and rewrite that. So there hasn't been, I don't have any demos today to show because there isn't anything demoable beyond what we already showed. But the code base is in a much better position right now, and we'll be hopefully in a place sometime, I'm hoping before the end of the year, where we're going to have a very simple installation process, and people can start using it in the browser as an experiment. And every time I talk about Lumen, I really have to also say that do not use it in production right now. Do not use it in production right now. I don't want, as soon as it comes out in a somewhat usable format, I don't want companies to start investing in it and then start getting upset if the API is churning. That's why we haven't released a website yet. We're being very careful. Things are being documented in the code, but we don't want to commit to API documentation just yet until we've settled upon what the API will be. But to kind of go into why we're doing this, there are some extremely good benefits. Actually, we don't know if there are good benefits. We believe that there are some really good benefits to compiling Beam into the browser and building out rich UI and reasoning about rich UI with Beam in OTP. We've seen evidence that reasoning about concurrent UI in Scenic ends up having a very easy and maintainable development process. I cited in my keynote a paper that Joe Armstrong wrote on building out X11 UI with Erlang. So there seems like there was enough at this point for us to start moving forward in some way. On top of that, most other languages are already well underway to target WebAssembly in some form. Most of them are taking the shortcut with mscripten, just so they can have a WebAssembly presence, but mscripten compiled runtime in the browser is not super performant. What we're doing is a complete reimplementation of the Beam from the ground up. We're leaving out parts of the Beam spec that don't make sense to use in the browser or would be impossible to use in the browser. Without a formal specification of the Beam, though, we're having to go through the original. I shouldn't say we. I'm not doing it. it's Paul, Luke, and Hans. They're having to go through and go through all the Beam code, talk with the Beam core team, determine what the accepted behavior should be, and implement it. So the good side of that is that we're going to end up with a highly optimized runtime in the browser that gives us a lot of really interesting options. We're targeting somewhere around maybe less than 2, maybe less than 300 kilobytes before we really get into heavy optimization of what the runtime will just be, as opposed to if we were to just compile the Beam within Scripten, we'd be probably like at 20 megabytes. The other interesting thing is that we have come across certain things that may or may not be bugs in Beam. So we've been trying our best to make the Beam team aware of and suggest or commit back fixes in those cases. But the performance story there is really going to come down to how well threading can work in WebAssembly and what ultimately gets implemented in WebAssembly specification for threads. We're hoping that we're going to be able to distribute the work across threads in WebAssembly. So we'll have processes for rendering, processes for computation, processes for event handling. So as opposed to in, say, a traditional client-side application, everything just happening in the main thread, and in certain cases, that main thread being blocked by either painting or some heavy event handling or just something that is blocking at the moment. Having real threading in the browser will be very interesting to see what type of performance benefits we get from it. In addition to this, we're also considering WASI as a compile target. So because we're already doing WASM, WASI is essentially the native specification that's built on top of WASM. So what we're hoping to come out of this with is being able to run native applications without having to run Erlang or Elixir on the server. In addition to this opens up a whole new world of possibilities for projects like NERVs. Right? So NERVs is currently limited to having to run on a IoT device that has an operating system on it. I'm going to be very, very careful. Huge asterisks, huge quotation marks. If this can happen, then that can happen. But if we're successful in this effort, we may be opening up completely new markets in terms of IoT development, like real IoT development. So running on super low power devices, devices that don't and cannot have like commercial grade operating systems on them. And these are things that I think would work extremely well with Elixir's concurrency model. So the second kind of question that companies ask themselves is, can I hire? Right? So the technology meets my needs. It has what I need. That's great. Who's going to build this? Who's going to maintain it at my company? How am I going to go out and find new talent? And admittedly, this is probably the biggest strike against Elixir right now. We're constantly asked when we are trying to sell Elixir as a solution to a company, this question. This question always comes up. I mean, our answer is that, oh, we can help train up your people, and that sometimes resonates. But a lot of companies, especially hiring managers, inside recruiters, HR, they want to be able to know that they have a ready and available talent pool that they can tap into, and one that is reasonably priced. I kind of hear the supply-demand problem for talent as described as the chicken or the egg, right? Like people aren't going to work in the language unless companies are willing to hire for it, and companies aren't going to want to hire for it if there aren't people working in it. But that's actually not true. In a supply-demand model, demand always comes before supply. Right? Supply is never going to just appear and the demand kind of comes up around it. There's always going to be a need for something, and then the market will eventually kind of get attuned into it and say, oh, this is a need that we can meet in some way. So the demand must come before the supply. We have to have companies that are out there asking for Elixir, even if some of them get turned off because of it. I mean, what's great, one of our clients is Apple, but they're always putting out job postings for Elixir developers. And I think that's just having that job posting out there is amazing because it signals to the development community that a company like Apple trusts Elixir, and they're actively working in it. And if you want to work at a company like Apple, then you should really consider Elixir as your next programming language. What can be done about this to help improve the supply of engineers that are out there? And I have to admit that Dockyard is actually very poor in this area. I believe in mentorship. I believe in bringing on junior developers. However, Dockyard is a remote company, and we've struggled with how do we incorporate junior developers into a remote company and oversee their progress appropriately. We tried it a few times. We failed every single time, and so we've been kind of gun shy about doing it again. I'd be really interested to talk to the remote companies that may have had success with this, but our ability to do this has not been there, unfortunately. But I think that other companies that don't have that remote problem, or maybe have solved it remotely, really think about finding good engineers, bringing them on, adopting them, bringing them up in the world, teaching them Elixir, teaching them functional programming. This is kind of a division of responsibility that the community itself has to feed into it. And we'd be helping ourselves by bringing in new people with new ideas, new energy into what is our currently relatively small world. In addition to that, I think companies should be reaching out to code schools and asking them if they have Elixir developers, even if you know they don't. Right? So code schools are kind of crucial in feeding the supply market in terms of available ready talent that is of generally somewhat good quality. And I say that not with like being snarky or anything. I just know that there's so many code schools. It's really difficult to kind of gauge the quality of them sometimes. Comes down to trust and experience. But if the code schools, I mean, they're businesses. If they start hearing that there's a demand for particular technology, they're probably going to start to look into it, start to develop programs. I know that we have some leaders in the community already that are running online training. So there's like Alchemist.camp and others such as that. Gaslight, another consultancy, has always been a good company for training. So these are areas that I still think that the community itself needs to push and get better at. We have to do more evangelization of Elixir in terms of bringing in new blood. Other areas that could be done, I know that Jose's done some of this, but like Summers of Code, right? Some sort of sponsorship program where there is a university student, maybe going for a master's or a PhD, and there's some sort of really big problem that exists in the Elixir world that this student can be sponsored to kind of push on. And then going back to my early days of meetup running, just install fests. Getting people's development environments up and running, I think is a big first step in kind of introducing them to any language. So the idea of are we talking about Elixir appropriately in our material, I always see like a lot of technologies start kind of coming around to the realization that they need to incorporate marketing in some sense. And we need to find out what our messaging is. And more often than not, their marketing content comes down to how do we sell the values of this technology to companies. But there's a whole other aspect of marketing that's called talent marketing. And how do we sell the values of the language to other engineers? And this comes in several forms. I think that peer-based anecdotes resonate very well. It's always nice to see on Hacker News if there is some sort of post about like the new version of Elixir. There's almost always extremely positive comments on there. And I think those type of things help out quite a bit. Case studies, outcomes, these things resonate very well too. There's, my mind keeps going back to what I mentioned earlier with Richard Feldman's talk, is that there's also that kind of stigma attached to it at times with functional programming. So a lot of people have started out in imperative object-oriented, and they can't find a way to make the jump mentally. So we have to find a way around that as a community. And finally, is the technology stable and will it be maintained? This is always kind of like the fear that some companies have, right? They just spent all this money building out, investing in technology. They just brought on all this payroll, and then the technology wanes for whatever reason. It's not, its future is not as rosy as people thought. Its APIs under constant churn. Updating from version to version is always going to be a pain. And then there is questions around its future. So any type of company should be considering this. Startups tend to look at it a little bit less because the nature of startups is that they're going to be more willing to take on risk. If the technology gives them some sort of competitive advantage over the existing late-stage companies in their market, they're willing to take on that risk at the cost of having to redo something later on. But ultimately, we want to be speaking towards not just startups, but also big name companies. So thankfully, Jose has already given us an answer on this, and I think it's a fantastic answer. So at the past 2 Elixir Confs, he's committed himself to the idea that there is no current plan for 2.0 beyond it just being like kind of cleaning up API deprecations. He at this, it's not recorded because he had some sort of, there was like a weird video thing at ELIXIR'S, but I don't know if he re-recorded it later on. But the kind of path forward for Elixir that he mentioned at this past year ELIXIRConf was that the API of Elixir is such that all new features are actually going to start outside of Elixir. And if something comes into it, it's going to, it has to be a really, really big one. But like things like Broadway that they've been working on, as far as I know, that's not something that's even be considered as part of the Elixir API. So we're going to be in a mode now of patches, maintenance, and just ongoing kind of support for it, which is pretty cool in my eyes. Other languages probably would look down upon this because they see new versions as a marketing opportunity. Like, oh, we implemented this new feature, and this helps us do this, and now we can talk about it, and we can write blog posts about it. We can, get ranked on Hacker News with it. But Jose's brought Elixir in the opposite direction. Like, consider this: like C++ doesn't even have this status. New features are being added to C++ at this point, but Elixir does. Python most certainly doesn't. JavaScript, no way. They put out a new version every single year. In my speaker notes, I did this every single year. So, companies and people want some sort of visibility into what they're investing in. And if they're constantly having to anticipate change, that is just calories that they can't commit towards other things. So I think one of the biggest values that we're not talking about as much as we should, because it's not a it's not a hot value, but is the idea that Elixir is done. I think that's it's something that should resonate at a higher level with big companies, and that could be the reason we're seeing companies like Apple investing in it. However, the long-term safe harbor position of Elixir is not known. So presumably, Jose doesn't want to be maintenance guy forever, but we have this new thing called the EEF, Erlang Ecosystem Foundation. So perhaps at some point, Elixir is essentially owned, maintained, and supported by the EEF. I think that would be an appropriate home for it at some point. So these, I said at the beginning, these things all feed into each other. If the technology has what I need, my company needs, then people are going to gravitate towards it. There's going to be some sort of either a demand-supply problem, or there's going to be someone saying, "Oh, these are cool features of technology. I should get interested in it." And if you can hire for it, then we're going to have more people in the community that can help maintain and keep the language and technology stable. So if we can say yes to all 3 of these things, and we can have good answers for all 3 of these things, it should go a long way towards adoption. However, is any of this even necessary? Let's put things in perspective for a minute. Elixir 1.0 only came out 3.5 years ago. This is like a blink. This is nothing. Within that 3.5-year period, it's already a top 100 TOB language. It's already a top Stack Overflow language. And it's been adopted by companies like Apple, Toyota, Coca-Cola, Motorola, Cars.com, Discord, etc. And I think that type of progress within a 3.5-year period is astounding. It's amazing. I think sometimes we lose perspective on that, right? It feels like Elixir should be everywhere at times, but we have to keep things in mind that it is still moving forward. It's growing, even if it's not the rate that you think it should be growing at, it's had some pretty impressive growth over a period of time, especially considering that, I mean, it's competing primarily against two of the other new languages that have come out, Go and Rust, that have significant corporate push behind it. So Elixir has a mature and stable API. There's a healthy demand for language and talent. And companies are finding Elixir every single day. So for me, I think this is fine. We also have to keep in mind that Elixir is first and foremost a community-driven effort. We cannot expect Jose to carry the water forever. The joke is that there must be multiple Joses, right? Because he's constantly giving feedback, he's constantly committing, he's doing more work than seems humanly possible at times. But we need more leaders in the community to be identified, to come into the community to help out. We need more people to step up, and we need more people to get themselves out of their own comfort zones and try to add back to the community in some way. And yes, I mean you. So I want to talk about Elixir's secret power. And in my experience, I've been a professional software developer for over 20 years. Elixir, I don't say this because it's Elixir conference, I'm trying to promote Elixir, but I believe that Elixir is actually the easiest programming language to commit back to participate in the development process of, for multiple reasons. One of which, beyond anything else in the language itself, is that the core team is incredibly helpful and empowering for new people to come and participate in the development of the language. Jose and many of the other core team members are really, really good about giving feedback. If a PR comes in and it's not what they're looking for, they'll hear you out, they'll listen to your use case. Sometimes you can change their mind, sometimes not, but at least they'll make you feel like you've been heard. And if PR comes in that seems like something that they want, but the code isn't there, they'll coach you through it. They'll coach you through and say, like, do this instead of that, and kind of guide you towards being a committer to the project. The idea there is that they're hoping to distribute their knowledge so that other people can get leveled up and start committing back. And there's nothing more empowering than getting the Jose hearts. It's always fun getting those. In fact, people like them so much that if Jose forgets them, someone else will do it for them. So one area that I feel like we need more of is our case studies and outcomes. And at Dockyard, we tried to do this. We really did. We tried to interview companies. We had announced that we were I was directing my marketing department to spend some time on interviewing nerves companies and trying to get some case studies out of companies in order to publish, not on the Dockyard website, but on the nerves website. I think if company A has similar problems to company B, and company B is solving it in a particular way, they're going to go back and say, oh, how did they solve it? Case studies are very, very powerful. So I want to talk about the top 3 case studies that exist, that are out there. Does anyone know what the #1 case study is for Elixir and Phoenix that's out there? Probably seen it. All right. Bleacher Report. This is an incredibly powerful case study. Does anyone know #2? Bleacher Report. #3? Bleacher Report. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's awesome to have the Bleacher Report story, but it's been out there for many years at this point, and I see it constantly referenced. I think it's helped push Elixir along and given some excellent data, and Ben has been amazing at putting this data together in a consumable and easily to consume format for companies to kind of say, oh, like, look at what they did and look at the type of benefit that they got. But we need more of these. We need more Bleacher Report-esque case studies. We need outcomes. We need companies that said, hey, we had a .NET infrastructure, and we went over to Elixir. We considered these round of technologies. Here's the reason we went with Elixir. And here's the outcome we expected, and here's what actually happened. It's a weird thing that I I put in my Lone Star Elixir Conf talk, and this was something that came about when I was trying to interview companies just for the data. But I don't know how easy that is to read. But the basic idea is that there's companies that are out there that are using Elixir that don't want to talk about Elixir because they consider Elixir to be this this kind of competitive advantage that they have, and they don't want to tip their hat to the competition. And there, I spoke with probably about 25 companies leading up to Lone Star, and this was at least 3 of them. After the conference, Devin Estes, he actually tweeted this out. He had since deleted the tweet because he removes his old tweets, so I reached out to him just so I could get the quote from him again. But independent, he hadn't seen my talk, he wasn't at my talk. It was about a week afterwards, by just complete chance, that a Fortune 100 company had reached out to him about consulting for Elixir, but they don't want to advertise that they're doing Elixir because they consider it a competitive advantage. He and I have chatted, and I'm pretty sure it's not one of the 3 that I had spoken to. And when I gave the Lone Star Elixir conference talk, I was like, oh, this is kind of a cool, compelling data point, that Elixir is so powerful that these companies don't want to talk about their secret sauce. I've kind of gone the opposite way on that since then, is that, I mean, these companies are sucking up talent in the space to a certain degree, a limited resource, as we all know. We need them to be talking about their outcomes. I don't think that any technology is going to be so good that, you know, they don't go into IEX and IEX writes the application for themselves. It's ridiculous to think that. These are probably the companies that we actually need these case studies from. So we need people that work at these companies to try to advocate internally. Say, hey, we have a compelling story. You know, can we write about it? Can we get some data out there in some form? One of the last things I want to talk about is that I get approached from time to time on other shops, and you know, they're like, oh, you know, Dockyard's lucky because you guys have Chris there, and you know that helps you, sell business. And yes, it does, of course. I mean, I tell people without any hesitation that we essentially bought credibility in the system to a certain degree. Our needs aligned with Chris's at the time, and so it worked out. But this shouldn't stop other companies from trying that same model. We need more companies that are willing to invest dollars into the ecosystem. The topics of interest could be anywhere, not just the gaps that I identified. If your company has particular problems, the odds are very high that other companies have those problems. There's plenty of smart engineers out there that want to be working on open source work. They don't want to be working on product work. I can tell you they definitely don't want to be working on billable hour work. They want to be working on something that resonates for them and is of value to them, and that's awesome. So one thing that's worked out for Dockyard over the past few years is if you're running a US shop, there are R&D tax credits. So absorbing the cost of having these people on payroll becomes a lot more easy. So in summary, if anyone wants to talk to me about those R&D tax credits, I'm happy to do so. It'd be great to get some other companies that are helping out in that regard. Ask for permission to write your company story around Elixir, even if you feel like it's a repetition. Like repetition actually is great. If you go on any of these political news shows, they're saying the same thing over and over and over again, and there's a reason why, is because repetition. So don't feel that like, oh, they put out something similar already, or it's not going to pick up the same steam. Like we need content, we need stories, we need people's experiences. Oops, did I get that last one? If you're a consultancy, I believe wholeheartedly that ELIXIR'S is one of the best technologies to invest in. On top of that, we've made similar efforts in the past to invest in other technologies and ecosystems. Being an engineer that runs a shop, I always wanted to help out and be part of that conversation. And Elixir, bar none, has been the best ecosystem for us to invest in. Jose is super easy to work with. He's super excited that other companies are coming through. There's no competition about it. It's not like he wants Plataforma Tech to just own the entire space, because I think he understands that if that were the case, the space would fail. Okay, 5 minutes. So he wants other people to, for lack of a better term, for that work to be distributed across the community as much as possible. And so do I. I don't want Dockyard to be seen as the one-stop shop where like all of the open source efforts are being paid for. I like for, because that's a small pond, right? I'd rather that the pond get really, really big and that everyone is benefiting from it. So let's come back to the start of this presentation. The question that was put forth to me was, how can Elixir beat Java? Going back to Richard Feldman's presentation, he really shed some light on this. So one of his slides here, his explanation for why Java got so big so quickly was that back in 2003, Sun Microsystems made a $500 million marketing campaign to push Java. So in 2019 dollars, that's really $700 million. I can tell you Dockyard does not have that money. Plataforma Tech does not have that money. And there's no company that's out there that's willing to invest it. So unless someone's got the money gun, this isn't going to happen. But again, this is fine. The other thing we have to consider too is that this is realistic graph of new languages introduced on Hacker News every single day, approximation. Is that the language market is more fragmented than it's ever been. We're kind of competing for smaller and smaller real estate. So we should feel very comfortable and happy that Elixir is growing at the rate that it is in such a fragmented and competitive market. Companies should feel assured that they chose a language that meets their needs. It's stable and will be maintained and has some amazing engineering talent behind it. And you engineers should all feel that Elixir is the right choice for your career and for the foreseeable future. Thank you. So before I got to go, I just want to do two things. Is that the Lumen project, we are seeking help. So for those that are looking for some open source to commit to, if there's companies out there that want to help us develop this technology, go on github.com/lumen. All the current compiler and runtime are all built in Rust. Eventually we'll get to the point where we're going to be looking for people out there that have ideas behind building a renderer, framework, et cetera, et cetera. These don't have to be owned by Dockyard. And finally, again, just a reminder, Dockyard, that we are for hire, and we'd like to work with anybody and everybody that is doing Elixir. So, thank you.
All right.